In the gilded halls of European palaces, where power and prestige were measured not only by crowns, but also by bloodlines, one royal family rose to heights few dynasties had ever reached, only to collapse under the weight of their own obsession with genetic purity. This was the Habsburg Dynasty, rulers of Europe for more than 6 centuries, who ultimately destroyed themselves through a practice as ancient as royalty itself, inbreeding. What began as a calculated political strategy designed to preserve influence and secure alliances gradually transformed into a genetic nightmare that would bring down one of history's most powerful and influential royal houses. The year was 1700, and within the royal palace of Madrid, anxious courtiers whispered in hushed tones about their king. Charles II of Spain, the last monarch of the Spanish Habsburg line, occupied the throne, yet he stood as a grotesque caricature of royal majesty rather than a symbol of power. His lower jaw jutted forward so severely that he could barely speak or chew. His tongue was so large for his mouth that he drooled constantly, unable to control it. His body was fragile, his mind painfully slow, and despite having entered into 2 marriages, he failed to achieve the one thing that mattered most in dynastic politics, producing an heir. At the Spanish court, he was mockingly referred to as El Hechizado, the bewitched. Many believed that witchcraft or divine punishment explained his numerous afflictions. What they could not have imagined, however, was that the true curse haunting their king was far more insidious. It was written deep within his DNA, an accumulated legacy of generations of Habsburg unions between close relatives. Charles II was not the victim of supernatural forces, but of the mathematical certainty of genetic disaster. Modern genetic analysis would later confirm the horrifying truth. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, a figure shockingly higher than that of a child born from a brother-sister union. In other words, the King of Spain was more inbred than the offspring of siblings. His entire being embodied the consequences of 2 centuries of dynastic marriages, where political advantage outweighed biological wisdom. His existence stood as a living testament to how the relentless pursuit of power can corrupt even the most fundamental aspects of human nature. The Habsburg story is not simply one of royal extravagance or political miscalculation. It is, at its core, a scientific cautionary tale written in the language of human suffering. It illustrates with brutal clarity how the laws of genetics operate with unyielding precision, indifferent to wealth, influence, or divine right. The family's greatest strength, their unity and exclusivity, proved to be their undoing, leading to physical deformities, mental disabilities, and eventually the extinction of their dynasty. When we turn the pages of this dark chapter in European history, we see more than just kings and queens clad in regalia. We encounter victims of a system that exalted bloodline purity above human welfare. The tale of the Habsburgs compels us to face uncomfortable truths about the relationship between power and biology, about the arrogance of dynastic ambition, and about the limits of human control. It reminds us that no measure of gold, no accumulation of territory, and no degree of political influence can ever defy the fundamental laws of nature. The rise and fall of the Habsburg dynasty stretches across continents and centuries, encompassing the Spanish Empire's golden age, the intricate politics of the Holy Roman Empire, and the grandeur of Austria-Hungary. Yet beneath the surface of pomp and ceremony, beneath the glittering processions and magnificent palaces, a silent disaster was unfolding. This disaster, written not in battles or revolutions, but in blood, proved more destructive than any invading army, devastating plague, or political upheaval. It is the story of how one family's obsession with keeping power confined to their own bloodline sowed the seeds of their destruction. It stands as a stark reminder that even the mightiest dynasties are subject to the unchanging laws of nature, and that the pursuit of genetic purity often leads inevitably to genetic catastrophe. The origins of the Habsburg dynasty can be traced back to the Swiss canton of Aargau in the 10th century. At the time, they were minor nobles with modest landholdings. Their name itself was derived from their ancestral seat, Habsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle. The name was fitting, for this family would eventually soar to unprecedented heights of European power. What began as a small noble house in the heart of Switzerland would, through relentless ambition, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering, transform into the most powerful royal dynasty in European history. This transformation from regional lords to continental rulers began in earnest during the late medieval period. Through carefully orchestrated marriages and well-timed military victories, the Habsburgs expanded their influence throughout the German-speaking lands of Central Europe. Their guiding motto became legendary: Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria, nubi. Let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry. This phrase perfectly encapsulated their strategy of expansion, one that prioritized matrimonial alliances over the battlefield. By securing the right unions, they did not merely gain territory, they inherited kingdoms. The turning point came in 1273, when Rudolf I of Habsburg was elected Holy Roman Emperor, establishing a precedent that would define European politics for centuries. The family would go on to dominate this prestigious title almost without interruption, embedding themselves as the cornerstone of the Holy Roman Empire. The vast, complex entity of Central Europe provided them not only with legitimacy, but also with enormous territorial influence. Through the imperial crown, the Habsburgs could determine the fate of bishoprics, command crucial trade routes, and form alliances that stretched far beyond their Austrian heartlands. Their reach expanded dramatically in 1496. When Maximilian I arranged for his son Philip the Handsome to marry Joanna of Castile, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This single union proved to be one of the most consequential matrimonial alliances in European history. Through it, the Habsburgs eventually inherited the vast Spanish Empire, including its sprawling overseas colonies in the New World. It was a perfect example of the family's strategy. Why seize lands by force when they could be acquired more securely and permanently through inheritance? By the 16th century, this strategy had borne astonishing fruit. Charles V, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, inherited an empire so vast that it became said of him that the sun never set upon his dominions. From his Habsburg ancestors, he received Austria and the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. From his Spanish grandmother Isabella, he inherited Castile, Aragon, and the rapidly expanding territories in the Americas. From his Burgundian lineage, he inherited the wealthy and strategically crucial Netherlands. Never before in European history had a single ruler commanded such vast, diverse, and far-reaching territories, stretching from the Americas to Eastern Europe, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. The sheer scale of Habsburg power during this era was without precedent in European history. They controlled the silver mines of Peru and Mexico, which fueled their immense wealth, and dominated the spice trade routes of the Spanish Netherlands, which linked them to the riches of Asia. They commanded the fertile agricultural lands of Hungary and Bohemia, ensuring both prosperity and stability, while their hold over the strategic Alpine passes gave them unrivaled influence in the movement of armies and commerce between northern and southern Europe. Their empire encompassed dozens of languages, cultures, and religions, offering both vast opportunities and enormous challenges that would test even the most capable of rulers. Yet, even as they reached the height of their glory, the seeds of their eventual downfall had already been sown. The vast expanse of their dominions created a persistent question that haunted the dynasty for centuries. How could they maintain control over such diverse and distant lands, while also preserving the unity of the ruling family? The solution they chose, intermarriage between different Habsburg branches, appeared logical at the time, but it would prove catastrophically short-sighted. What had once been a brilliant strategy for expansion gradually gave way to an increasingly insular and dangerous practice. As their power swelled, so too did their sense of exclusivity and their belief in the superiority of their own bloodline. Pragmatic political unions slowly transformed into an obsession with maintaining the purity of Habsburg blood, setting the stage for the genetic disasters that would one day destroy them. In the ruthless political landscape of 15th and 16th century Europe, marriage was never about affection or companionship. It was a tool of survival, a calculated move in the chessboard of power. Royal unions secured borders, prevented wars, and strengthened claims to contested thrones. The Habsburgs understood this better than anyone, and in the beginning they executed this strategy with unmatched precision. Philip the Fair's marriage to Joanna of Castile brought Spain into the Habsburg fold. Other carefully arranged marriages tied them to Portugal, England, and France, expanding their influence across Europe and cementing their position as the continent's preeminent dynasty. But over time, this external strategy shifted. As the Habsburg territories grew larger and their power consolidated, the family became increasingly obsessed with protecting their holdings from fragmentation. The greatest fear was that valuable lands might pass into the hands of non-Habsburg heirs through marriage. The solution seemed obvious: marry within the family to keep the empire intact and the bloodline untainted by outside influence. What began as shrewd political maneuvering hardened into a rigid system of endogamy, marriages confined to the same family group. By the mid-16th century, this approach had become the defining characteristic of Habsburg dynastic policy. Princes and princesses were systematically paired with cousins, uncles, nieces, and other relatives who shared the same ancestral line. The examples are striking. Charles V married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. His son, Philip II, first wed his cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, and later took as his bride his own niece, Anna of Austria, who was 21 years his junior. The trend continued. Philip II's son, Philip III, married his second cousin, Margaret of Austria. Their son, Philip I, wed his first cousin, Elizabeth of France, and after her death, took another disturbing step by marrying his own niece, Mariana of Austria, who was 30 years younger than him. With each passing generation, the genetic pool narrowed. The same ancestral genes were recombined again and again, increasing the risks of inherited defects with alarming certainty. The Habsburgs even developed elaborate genealogical charts to track family relationships, ensuring that marriages technically avoided the closest degrees of consanguinity forbidden by the Catholic Church. But these calculations were based on canonical law rather than biological reality. The dynasty was obeying the rules of religion while utterly ignoring the laws of nature, and the price would be devastating. The Catholic Church might have permitted marriages between first cousins or even between an uncle and his niece, but genetics follows a different set of laws that are far less forgiving. From time to time, courtiers and advisors raised concerns about the health risks posed by such close marriages, especially as physical deformities and mental disabilities became increasingly common among Habsburg children. Yet these warnings were consistently ignored. Political necessity always outweighed biological prudence, and the dynasty clung to the deeply ingrained belief that their blood was inherently superior to that of other noble families. In fact, the Habsburgs convinced themselves that their genetic material was so exceptional that it could only be strengthened by concentration, not diluted by mixing with outsiders. This mindset created an artificial and ever-narrowing marriage market. Suitable Habsburg partners became increasingly scarce, and as a result, age gaps between spouses grew larger while the degree of genetic relationship grew closer. What had once been a flexible strategy for building political alliances had hardened into a rigid doctrine that bound successive generations to an ever-tightening genetic spiral. This spiral could lead to only one end: catastrophe. And nowhere did this catastrophe manifest more dramatically than in the tragic figure of Charles II of Spain. To grasp the full scope of the Habsburg tragedy, we must first understand the unforgiving mathematics of genetics. Every human being carries two copies of each gene, one inherited from the mother and one from the father. In cases where parents are unrelated, their children benefit from genetic diversity. Harmful recessive genes carried by one parent are often masked by healthy dominant genes from the other, preventing them from being expressed. But when parents are closely related, this natural protection breaks down. The genetic deck becomes stacked, and the consequences can be catastrophic. Geneticist Sewell Wright developed the concept of the inbreeding coefficient to mathematically measure this risk. The coefficient represents the probability that an individual has inherited two identical copies of a gene from the same ancestor through both parents. In populations with no inbreeding, the coefficient is 0. For the children of first cousins, the value rises to approximately 0.625. For the offspring of siblings, it soars to 0.25. Charles II of Spain exceeded even that. His inbreeding coefficient was calculated at 0.254, making him astonishingly more inbred than the child of a brother-sister union. This nightmare figure did not result from a single incestuous marriage, but from centuries of relentless endogamy. Charles II's genealogy, when charted, resembles not a branching family tree, but a tangled web in which the same ancestors appear repeatedly. Philip II of Spain alone appears in his family tree 14 times, while Emperor Charles V appears 8 times. Instead of drawing from a wide and diverse pool of forebears, Charles II's ancestry had collapsed into a dangerously narrow circle. The biological consequences of such extreme inbreeding were both predictable and devastating. Harmful recessive genes, which in a healthy genetic background would normally remain silent and hidden, were brought to the surface. When an individual inherits identical defective copies from both parents, those hidden flaws become expressed in full force. And in Charles II, the culmination of generations of narrowed bloodlines, these consequences reached their most tragic and visible expression. The effects of inbreeding do not stop at a single trait. They compound across multiple genetic systems, disrupting everything from physical development to cognitive function, immune defenses, and reproductive capability. Geneticists call this phenomenon inbreeding depression, and its manifestations are wide-ranging and devastating. Physical deformities become increasingly common, most famously represented by the Habsburg jaw, a severely protruding lower mandible that made eating and speaking difficult. Cognitive impairments and developmental delays grow more frequent and more severe. The immune system weakens, leaving individuals vulnerable to infections and disease. And most critically for dynastic survival, fertility collapses. Infant mortality rises, miscarriages become common, and entire bloodlines risk extinction through sterility. Modern research has confirmed the scale of this genetic decline. Spanish geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez and his colleagues conducted a landmark study, analyzing the genealogical records of over 3,000 members of the Habsburg Dynasty across 16 generations. Their findings were conclusive. The Habsburg family tree stands as one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding ever documented in human history. The study revealed a direct correlation between the degree of inbreeding and the prevalence of physical and mental disabilities among Habsburg descendants. In other words, the more the dynasty married within itself, the more visible and severe the biological consequences became. The Habsburg tragedy also demonstrates the cumulative nature of inbreeding. Early marriages between relatively distant relatives produced subtle and manageable effects, but as the genetic pool contracted and the same ancestral genes were recombined generation after generation, the damage intensified. Each generation inherited not only the wealth and power of their ancestors, but also the compounded burden of genetic flaws. The process is mathematically relentless. Once set in motion, every subsequent generation builds upon the genetic damage of the last, creating a cascading decline that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Modern genetic analysis sheds further light on the specific conditions that afflicted the dynasty in its later centuries. The distinctive Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, appears to have been caused by recessive genes that became fixed within the family line. Pituitary hormone deficiencies linked to growth abnormalities and reproductive failures seen in several rulers also match the inheritance patterns of inbreeding-related disorders. These were not random misfortunes, they were the predictable outcome of centuries of genetic isolation. The most visible and enduring emblem of this decline was the Habsburg jaw. More than a mere cosmetic quirk, it became the dynasty's genetic calling card, a physical manifestation of their obsession with bloodline purity. Characterized by an abnormally large and protruding lower jaw and chin, mandibular prognathism began as a subtle feature in early Habsburg portraits. Over time, however, it evolved into a grotesque deformity, leaving later rulers with faces that bore the unmistakable stamp of hereditary damage. This condition was not merely an aesthetic blemish, it represented a fundamental malformation of the facial bones. In severe cases, the lower teeth jutted far beyond the upper teeth, making it impossible to bite or chew properly. An enlarged tongue, often disproportionate to the mouth cavity, compounded the difficulties, leading to chronic drooling and pronounced speech impediments. Daily life for afflicted rulers became a constant struggle with the most basic human functions. Perhaps most striking of all, history has preserved the evidence in paint and canvas. The portraits of Habsburg rulers serve as a visual record of this decline, capturing the gradual exaggeration of the jaw from one generation to the next. These images chart the dynasty's genetic deterioration as clearly as any scientific study, transforming the faces of monarchs into a haunting timeline of biological collapse. Early Habsburg monarchs like Maximilian I show only subtle hints of jaw protrusion. In his portraits, the trait appears as a faint irregularity rather than a defining feature. However, as we progress through the family tree, the deformity becomes increasingly pronounced. With each generation, Charles V displays a moderate version of the condition, noticeable yet not debilitating. His son, Philip II, exhibits even more severe symptoms, the jaw pushing outward more prominently. By the time we reach Charles II of Spain, the deformity had reached its most extreme form, dominated his entire facial structure, and rendered his appearance both unsettling and tragic. Contemporary accounts describe Charles II's jaw in disturbing detail. The Venetian ambassador observed that the king has a ravenous stomach and swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. French courtiers echoed these reports, noting that Charles could barely close his mouth and that food often slipped out as he attempted to eat. His speech was so impaired that foreign diplomats often required interpreters to understand him, even when he spoke in their own languages. What should have been simple acts of daily life, like eating and communicating, became immense struggles due to the severity of his deformity. Beyond the infamous jaw, the Habsburg dynasty suffered from a host of additional physical deformities that became increasingly common with each generation. Hydrocephalus, an abnormal accumulation of fluid in the brain, appeared multiple times in the family line. This condition caused the head to enlarge disproportionately, often leading to cognitive impairment. Several Habsburg children were born with this affliction, and those who survived frequently experienced developmental delays and learning disabilities that hindered their ability to function in courtly and political life. Skeletal abnormalities also plagued the dynasty well beyond facial deformities. Many later Habsburgs displayed unusual body proportions, with some individuals exhibiting abnormally short stature, while others grew to unusual heights. Joint problems were widespread, with severe arthritis affecting family members at young ages, leaving them weakened and limited in mobility. The so-called Habsburg walks became characteristic, a shuffling, unsteady gait that reflected the underlying neurological and skeletal problems afflicting the dynasty. Skin conditions added further to the growing list of hereditary afflictions. Contemporary accounts describe cases of eczema, unusual pigmentation patterns, and signs of premature aging. These ailments likely stemmed from compromised immune systems, weakened by generations of inbreeding, leaving Habsburg descendants vulnerable to infections, chronic inflammation, and visible dermatological disorders. Each outward mark of disease testified to the hidden genetic decline eroding the dynasty from within. Perhaps most devastating for dynastic survival was the damage to the reproductive system. Many Habsburg men suffered from varying degrees of sexual dysfunction and infertility, while women endured high rates of miscarriages and infant mortality. The family's inability to consistently produce healthy heirs became a recurring tragedy in Habsburg history. Despite desperate attempts at conception, numerous marriages remained childless, weakening alliances and threatening the continuity of the royal bloodline. Fertility, once a cornerstone of dynastic power, became one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Charles II of Spain stands as the most tragic embodiment of the consequences of systematic inbreeding. Born on November 6, 1661, he was the son of Philip I of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, a union that united two already heavily inbred branches of the family. From the very moment of his birth, it was evident that Charles represented the culmination of 2 centuries of genetic deterioration. His frail body, disfigured features, and weak constitution embodied the accumulated damage of countless generations of close marriages. He was not simply a sickly monarch, but the living manifestation of a dynasty's refusal to escape the tightening trap of its own bloodline. The infant Charles barely survived the earliest years of his life. Contemporary accounts describe a sickly child who consistently failed to meet even the most basic developmental milestones. He did not speak until the age of 4, and he could not walk without assistance until he was 8 years old. Throughout his childhood, he required constant medical attention, as his frailty alarmed both family and physicians. Court doctors were baffled by the range and severity of his conditions, offering explanations that ranged from divine punishment to the influence of witchcraft. What they did not understand, however, was that they were witnessing the inevitable result of centuries of inbreeding, the merciless arithmetic of genetics taking its toll on the dynasty. As Charles grew older, his physical deformities became more pronounced and disturbing. His jaw protruded so severely that he was unable to chew solid food properly, forcing him to survive on a mostly liquid diet for much of his life. His tongue was disproportionately large for his mouth, causing constant drooling and rendering his speech nearly incomprehensible. Foreign ambassadors reported that understanding the king's words required extraordinary concentration and frequent guesswork, even for native Spanish speakers. His body was just as compromised as his face. Standing barely 5 feet tall despite having tall ancestors, he possessed limbs that were disproportionate and a posture that was severely hunched. He suffered from frequent seizures that often left him unconscious for hours, and physicians noted repeated episodes in which he lost control of his bodily functions. His hands trembled so persistently that even the simple act of signing documents or performing minor tasks of governance became a struggle. The limitations of Charles II extended beyond his physical frailty to his mind. His mental capacity was severely diminished, though the extent of his impairment was often concealed by the elaborate court protocols that shielded the monarch from scrutiny. He struggled to grasp complex concepts and relied heavily on advisors for even the most basic decisions. His education was minimal, as tutors found it nearly impossible to maintain his attention or help him retain knowledge. Yet despite these deficits, he was expected to rule a vast empire spanning Europe, the Americas, and Asia, a responsibility far beyond his cognitive abilities. Equally troubling was the king's emotional state. Contemporary observers describe him as prone to violent outbursts of rage, which would often be followed by long episodes of deep melancholy. He was reportedly terrified of his own reflection and frequently refused to look into mirrors. Court insiders noted that his behavior often remained childlike, well into adulthood, with an obsession for toys and games considered shockingly inappropriate for a monarch. Alongside this immaturity, he displayed signs of paranoia, convinced that enemies were conspiring against him, though his suspicions were frequently the product of delusion rather than reality. Sexual dysfunction further defined Charles's tragic existence, creating a dynastic crisis of succession. Despite being married twice, he was completely unable to father children. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans was marked by years of humiliating medical examinations as court physicians desperately sought explanations for the couple's childlessness. After her death, Charles wed Maria Anna of Neuburg, but this second union proved equally barren, confirming the monarchy's worst fears. The Spanish court's desperation over the king's condition grew increasingly frantic, leading to bizarre and extreme measures. Believing Charles to be under demonic possession, priests and exorcists performed rituals on a regular basis. Physicians prescribed unusual and often grotesque treatments, including the application of hot animal entrails to his body and the ingestion of exotic substances thought to restore virility and strength. These desperate attempts only underscored the helplessness of a court trapped by superstition, clinging to ritual and remedy, while the genetic fate of their monarch was sealed by the bloodline itself. Court astrologers were summoned, and elaborate rituals were performed in desperate attempts to restore the king's health and vitality. Yet, as Charles II's reign dragged on without producing an heir, the great powers of Europe watched with growing anticipation and anxiety. The Spanish Empire in 1700 was immense, encompassing not only the Iberian Peninsula but also vast territories in the Americas, the Spanish Netherlands, and several Italian states. The looming question of who would inherit this global empire upon Charles's death became one of the most pressing diplomatic issues of the age, setting the stage for a devastating continental war. The main claimants to the Spanish throne represented different branches of European royalty, each advancing genealogical arguments of legitimacy. Louis XIV of France claimed the inheritance for his grandson, Philip of Anjou, basing his case on the marriage of his son to Charles II's older sister. Meanwhile, Emperor Leopold I of Austria, Charles's cousin and fellow Habsburg, insisted that the throne should pass to his second son, Archduke Charles, in order to preserve the Spanish dominions within the larger Habsburg dynasty. Other European powers, each with their own interests, promoted alternative candidates who could serve as counterbalances to either French or Austrian dominance. Charles II himself was painfully aware of the crisis that his childlessness had unleashed. In his more lucid moments, he understood that his death would likely ignite a European war. Within the Spanish court, factions lobbied intensively for their preferred outcomes. Some supported the French Bourbon claim, convinced that France's military strength could safeguard Spanish holdings, while others argued fiercely for preserving Habsburg control through the Austrian branch. The king, caught between pressures and uncertainty, altered his will multiple times, reflecting both his indecision and the immense political forces bearing down on him. In October 1700, Charles II finally reached a decision. In his final will, he named Philip of Anjou as his universal heir. Several factors influenced this choice: the French candidate's closer blood ties through the female line, the overwhelming military power of France to defend Spain's territories, and the argument that the empire should remain intact under a single ruler rather than being divided among multiple claimants. When Charles II died on November 1700 at the age of 38, his death marked not only the end of his personal suffering, but also the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. The autopsy, conducted by Spanish court physicians, presented a grotesque catalogue of his physical ruin. His heart was described as being the size of a peppercorn, his lungs as corroded, and his intestines as putrefied. Most shocking of all, he was found to have only a single testicle, black as carbon. While expressed in the medical terminology of the 17th century, these findings clearly reveal the catastrophic organ failures and systemic collapse brought on by extreme inbreeding. The European response to Charles's will and to France's swift acceptance of the inheritance was immediate and decisive. The prospect of Bourbon control over the Spanish Empire threatened to upset the carefully maintained balance of power that had preserved a fragile stability across Europe. Austria flatly refused to recognize the French succession, and soon England, the Dutch Republic, Portugal and several German states united in what became known as the Grand Alliance, opposing France and Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession 1701–1714 erupted, becoming one of the most devastating conflicts in European history to that point. Battles unfolded across multiple theaters, from the fields of Flanders to the rugged mountains of Spain, from the waters of the Mediterranean to the Caribbean colonies. The war featured legendary commanders such as the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy, and it introduced innovations in tactics and strategy that would shape the nature of Amer for centuries to come. The human toll of the war was staggering. Historians estimate that between 400,000 and 1.25 million people perished directly from the conflict, while millions more endured the secondary devastation of famine, disease, and economic collapse. The dynastic ambitions of Europe's royal houses, born from the genetic decay of one dynasty, had plunged the continent into a conflict that reshaped the balance of power for generations. Entire regions were left devastated by the relentless fighting, and the economic consequences of the war reverberated across Europe for decades. The human and financial costs were staggering, and yet at the heart of all this destruction lay one man's inability to father children, an inability that was itself the direct result of centuries of relentless Habsburg inbreeding. The War of the Spanish Succession did more than decide who would rule Spain. It fundamentally transformed the European balance of power and signaled the beginning of the end for Habsburg dominance. The treaties of Utrecht 1713 and Rustad 1714, which concluded the conflict, represented far more than a mere redistribution of land and titles. They symbolized the collapse of the Habsburg strategy of dynastic unity maintained through inbreeding. What had once been presented as a grand design to preserve the empire's cohesion had instead left it vulnerable to ruin. The once mighty Habsburg domains were now permanently divided, with consequences that would echo throughout European politics for centuries to come. Under the terms of the peace settlements, Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain. However, to address European fears of Bourbon dominance, he was forced to renounce any future claim to the French throne, ensuring that the crowns of France and Spain would never unite. Despite retaining the Spanish throne, Spain was compelled to cede vast and strategically vital territories. The Austrian Habsburgs gained the Spanish Netherlands, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, thereby shifting the balance of power in Central Europe. Britain secured Gibraltar and Minorca, establishing a permanent foothold in the Mediterranean and strengthening its global naval power. The partition of the Spanish Empire marked the definitive end of Habsburg Spain as a great European power. The territorial losses alone were devastating, but the psychological impact was perhaps even more severe. For nearly 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had justified their inbreeding practices on the grounds of preserving dynastic unity and preventing fragmentation of their vast empire. Yet the settlements of Utrecht and Restad demonstrated the utter failure of this strategy. Despite the genetic sacrifices made across generations, the empire still fractured and diminished. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, though beneficiaries of Spain's losses, faced its own set of challenges. Emperor Leopold I had died during the war in 1705, and his son Joseph I died childless in 1711, leaving Archduke Charles to abandon his claim to the Spanish throne in order to become Emperor Charles VI. While Charles inherited the mantle of Holy Roman Emperor, he now ruled over a patchwork of territories that lacked both the wealth and global influence of the Spanish Empire. The Austrian Habsburgs had gained land, but lost the promise of undisputed supremacy. Charles VI himself was plagued by the same succession dilemmas that had doomed the Spanish line: His marriage to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel was politically advantageous, but though she bore him children, only 2 daughters survived into adulthood. Obsessed with securing his legacy, Charles spent much of his reign pushing for acceptance of the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree that would allow his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit his domains, despite the Salic law traditions that barred female succession. His struggles reflected a dynasty still haunted by the succession crises born of inbreeding and political short-sightedness. The genetic legacy of Habsburg endogamy continued to afflict the Austrian line, though not always as catastrophically as in Spain. Physical deformities and cognitive disabilities appeared with troubling regularity among descendants. Infant mortality remained high, and many marriages proved childless. Even those who survived often endured chronic health problems that limited their ability to rule with strength or effectiveness. Though less extreme than the Spanish experience, the Austrian Habsburgs remained trapped within the same genetic web that had long ensnared their dynasty. The social and economic consequences of Habsburg decline extended far beyond the royal courts. The weakening of the Spanish Empire after the War of the Spanish Succession accelerated the erosion of its American colonies over the following centuries. Economic disruption, coupled with staggering war debts, generated instability that bred social unrest and political upheaval. Periodic revolutions and civil wars erupted across Spain and its territories, reflecting both the empire's diminished capacity and the long-term consequences of dynastic decay. The intellectual climate of the Enlightenment began to challenge the very foundations upon which Habsburg rule had long rested. Philosophers and political theorists across Europe questioned the divine right of kings, the legitimacy of hereditary monarchy, and the wisdom of dynastic marriages that had for centuries defined aristocratic power. The Habsburgs, whose dynasty embodied the excesses and dangers of inbreeding, became a powerful cautionary tale. Critics of aristocratic privilege and advocates of merit-based systems of government used the Habsburg example to highlight the failings of hereditary rule and the instability it produced. Despite the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line in 1700, the Austrian branch continued for another 2 centuries. Yet the genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding remained a recurring curse, undermining their power and stability. Each new generation faced the same grim challenges: high infant mortality, physical deformities, mental instability, and fertility problems. These biological weaknesses repeatedly threatened dynastic continuity. Thus, the Habsburgs found themselves ruling over vast and diverse territories, but at the same time burdened with a lineage cursed by fragility. Maria Theresa, who inherited the Austrian domains in 1740, represented a partial recovery from these genetic afflictions. Her marriage to Francis of Lorraine introduced new genetic material into the bloodline, and their remarkable brood of 16 children seemed to suggest that outbreeding might alleviate some of the dynasty's inherited weaknesses. However, even this apparent renewal could not erase centuries of accumulated damage. Several of their children displayed signs of physical deformities, mental illness, or developmental problems that compromised their ability to govern effectively. Among Maria Theresa's children, the most famous was Marie Antoinette, who married Louis XV of France. She became an enduring symbol of royal extravagance and detachment from the struggles of ordinary people. Although her downfall during the French Revolution was primarily driven by political and social unrest, some historians point to her emotional instability and poor judgment as possible echoes of her Habsburg inheritance. Her initial inability to bear an heir further reflected the persistent fertility struggles that had haunted her ancestors. Centuries later, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary, who reigned from 1848 to 1916, embodied both the resilience and the futility of Habsburg rule. His reign was unusually long, and he genuinely attempted reforms to preserve the empire. Yet his personal life was marked by tragedies that eerily mirrored the dynasty's cursed legacy. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died by suicide in the infamous Meierling incident. His beloved wife, Empress Elisabeth, known as Sisi, was assassinated. and his nephew and designated heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was murdered in Sarajevo, an event that triggered the First World War. World War I proved to be the fatal blow to the already fragile Habsburg dynasty. The multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, riven by nationalist movements and economic challenges, could not withstand the immense strain of prolonged global conflict. Military defeat, economic collapse, and revolutionary upheaval led to the empire's disintegration. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Charles I renounced his role in state affairs, marking the effective end of 6 centuries of Habsburg rule. Modern genetic studies have since confirmed what historians long suspected. The biological weaknesses of the Habsburg dynasty were central to its decline. Research conducted by Spanish geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez and his team revealed that inbreeding coefficients within the later generations of the family reached extraordinarily high levels, so high that they virtually guaranteed the emergence of severe genetic disorders. The study concluded that the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line was likely caused by the repeated appearance of the same deleterious alleles, passed down and reinforced through generations of incestuous unions. The Habsburg legacy stands as a powerful reminder of the dangers of genetic isolation and the vital importance of genetic diversity for human health and long-term survival. Their story has been repeatedly cited by geneticists, historians, and medical professionals to illustrate the consequences of consanguineous marriage and the mathematical inevitability of genetic deterioration within isolated populations. In the modern world, the Habsburg example has gained renewed relevance as scientists study the effects of limited genetic diversity in small populations, whether in isolated human communities, endangered species, on the brink of extinction, or even in theoretical scenarios of space colonization. The dynasty's genetic collapse provides concrete, real-world data on how inbreeding impacts complex organisms over multiple generations, transforming their history from a matter of curiosity into a valuable source of scientific and medical insight. The rise and fall of the Habsburg dynasty represents one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of how biological laws can override political authority, economic wealth, and social prestige. Their story transcends the realm of dynastic politics and enters the broader discussion human survival, showing how genetics and power intersect in ways that cannot be ignored. The precision with which genetic deterioration destroyed what was once the most powerful royal house in Europe offers a sobering reminder. No degree of ambition, wealth, or influence can ultimately defy the fundamental laws of biology. The tragedy of the Habsburgs illustrates the peril that emerges when ruling elites become too isolated from the wider human gene pool, entangling politics and biology in a dangerous and destructive cycle. Initially, the Habsburg strategy of using marriage alliances was politically brilliant. By carefully arranging unions, they were able to consolidate territories and establish an empire that spanned vast regions of Europe and extended into the New World. Yet, as generations passed, this strategy shifted toward endogamy, marriage within the family itself. This practice, though intended to preserve dynastic power and unity, violated the basic principles of genetic health. Medieval and early modern societies lacked scientific understanding of heredity, but the underlying biological mechanisms operated with relentless efficiency. What began as a political triumph ultimately turned into a genetic disaster. Modern genetic research has since confirmed what historical accounts long suggested. The physical deformities, mental disabilities, and fertility problems that plagued the later generations of the Habsburgs were not random misfortunes, but the inevitable outcome of sustained inbreeding. Concepts such as inbreeding depression, the accumulation of genetic load, and the statistical inevitability of harmful recessive alleles becoming expressed explain why the Habsburgs' dynastic strategy was doomed from the outset. The case of Charles II of Spain is perhaps the most extreme example. His inbreeding coefficient, measured at 0.254, was equivalent to that of a child born to siblings rather than to individuals from a healthy, diverse population. His frailty and deformities embodied the terminal stage of centuries of genetic mismanagement. The Habsburg case also highlights the role of cultural and religious forces in perpetuating destructive practices, even when their harmful consequences became undeniable. The Catholic Church's strict prohibition on divorce meant that harmful marriages could not be dissolved, regardless of their biological implications. At the same time, religious justifications for monarchical authority, grounded in divine right and the supposed superiority of bloodlines, created powerful ideological barriers against questioning dynastic marriage strategies. This combination of faith, tradition, and politics blinded the ruling class to the growing evidence of genetic decline. Rational reassessment of policy was obstructed by beliefs that reinforced loyalty to family purity, no matter the human cost. The political consequences of Habsburg genetic decline extended far beyond the dynasty itself. Their biological weaknesses shaped alliances, triggered wars, and influenced the fate of millions across Europe and the Americas. The decline of the Spanish Habsburg line not only ended a chapter of dynastic power, but also altered the trajectory of global empires, shifting balances of power that would affect the modern world for centuries. In this way, the downfall of one royal family due to genetic collapse had ripple effects that reshaped the course of world history. The War of the Spanish Succession, triggered by Charles II's inability to produce an heir, resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths and permanently reshaped the balance of power in Europe. The economic disruption, territorial changes, and diplomatic realignments that followed from the Habsburgs' genetic failure influenced the development of entire nations for centuries. What began as a dynastic crisis soon became a continental conflict that scarred the political and social fabric of Europe for generations. Contemporary parallels to the Habsburg situation can still be found in various isolated populations around the world, from small island communities to certain religious or ethnic groups that continue to practice endogamy. The effects of genetic isolation remain a topic of urgent study. Medical geneticists analyze these populations to better understand the risks posed by limited genetic diversity and to develop strategies for safeguarding genetic health in small or closed communities. In this way, the Habsburg example provides historical depth to modern scientific inquiry, serving as a case study that illuminates the long-term consequences of inbreeding while reinforcing the importance of genetic counseling and population genetics in maintaining overall human well-being. The dynasty's story also offers profound insights into the intersection of power and biological fitness. The Habsburgs believed that their royal status and divine appointment made them inherently superior to other human beings. This belief justified their strict marriage practices, which prioritized bloodline purity above all else. Yet biology operates by different rules. Genetic fitness relies on diversity, resilience, and adaptation, not on social rank, political authority, or inherited privilege. The collapse of the Habsburg dynasty demonstrates with brutal clarity that biological laws ultimately override human constructions of power and status. In our modern era of genetic testing, assisted reproductive technologies, and growing knowledge of hereditary diseases, the Habsburg legacy carries new significance. Their decline serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of isolation. It underscores that even traits perceived as beneficial, such as physical resemblance or dynastic continuity, can become destructive when repeatedly concentrated through inbreeding. The pursuit of genetic purity, whether motivated by ideology, tradition, or power, often results not in strength, but in genetic catastrophe. The ultimate message of the Habsburg story is both humbling and universal. Human beings, no matter their wealth, power, or social standing remain subject to the same biological laws that govern all forms of life. Their 6th-century reign, followed by a dramatic and irreversible collapse, reminds us that genetic health is not a luxury but a fundamental necessity. The diversity of the human gene pool is one of our species' greatest assets, a safeguard against the vulnerabilities that destroyed Europe's most powerful dynasty. In the end, the downfall of the Habsburgs was not brought about by invading armies, revolutions, or political conspiracies, but by the quiet and inexorable mathematics of genetics. Their tragedy continues to echo across centuries, offering timeless lessons about biology, politics, and the fragile balance upon which human societies rest.